This is Undead Citadel, something I have waited a long time to say, as this physics-based hack and slasher has been in development for what feels like the beginning of VR. Joining the ranks of games like Blade and Sorcery, Hellsplit Arena, and Swordsmen VR, Undead Citadel looks to bring something to VR headsets that all those games lacked: a full single-player campaign. I've killed hundreds of the undead in the name of research, so stick around and I'll let you know if this game was worth the wait. Hey guys, it's Chris from the VR Grid, and welcome to the channel. If you like this video, give it a like, and if you're interested in more VR content from us, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss new videos as they drop. And if you're looking to join our VR conversations, feel free to leave a comment. We love talking to you. Undead Citadel wastes no time in getting players into the carnage, not even letting story get in its way. Essentially, you are a soldier hellbent on getting to the depths of a heavily fortified citadel to end the onslaught of the undead. And that's about all there is to it, and I'm absolutely fine with that, as I came for the combat, not the story. Looking first at the gameplay options awaiting players, we are greeted with the usual Horde mode, which offers up 3 wave-based arenas in which players can gear up with their favorite weapons from their selection of unlocked weapons in their armory. Additionally, if players simply want to try out their new weapons quickly without jumping into a full Horde mode, they can head right into the armory game option itself and spawn a few enemies to practice with. Again, the weapons on offer are pulled from your collection of unlocked weapons, and Undead Citadel offers up a pretty complete collection of medieval era weapons. In fact, there are 80 in total, and range from single and two-handed swords, blunt weapons, and battle axes, as well as a collection of bows for ranged attacks and firebombs that can be thrown. Additionally, players can arm themselves with an assortment of potions that when used can buff your character with abilities such as freeze attacks, heavy attacks, and the option to temporarily slow down incoming and outgoing attacks. However, all these fun little toys are locked at the outset of the game, which takes us to the primary game mode in Undead Citadel, the single-player campaign. Now, this is something I've wanted from games like Blade and Sorcery and Hellsplit Arena. For as fun as tearing apart enemies is, I personally found that I craved some sense of progression beyond beating waves of enemies, and I wanted a world to explore while I killed things. Undead Citadel offers players a fairly linear single-player campaign that will take about 5 to 6 hours to progress through, and while it certainly isn't the deepest gameplay experience I've ever had, I found it a very welcome addition to this style of VR slasher. Taking place almost entirely inside the Citadel walls, the bulk of the campaign revolves around a collection of areas, each with a locked or blocked exit that requires players to find that exit key or a flame to burn away the rubble. Throughout these areas are buildings that can be and should be entered and explored. Areas often contain a lot of these buildings, with some having multiple entrances, and I'll admit that going through these can get a bit tiresome, but is saved somewhat by the excellent variety in their layouts and designs, making for little repetition of building interiors, and this really helped to keep things a bit fresh. Often, buildings contain nothing but food to heal yourself with, but exploring is key, as it may give you advantage points on enemies in the street, reveal hidden keys, and can be especially useful on the game's higher difficulty levels, as scrounging can reveal hidden consumables such as potions and firebombs, as well as hidden chests that can contain more consumables, in addition to rare and higher-end weapons than the ones you might pull off dead enemies. As I previously mentioned, melee weapons range between blade and blunt, as well as single and two-handed weapons. Each found weapon is rated for both its damage and durability, with the latter changing as the weapon is used, allowing players to tell how much usage is left in the weapon. And if you're not understanding what I'm saying, yes, weapons break here. Found melee weapons, regardless of size, can be stored on either side of your waist, with potions being stored on the front of your belt. Additionally, there are a few different bows to be found in the world, and when acquired can be stored on your left shoulder, with a quiver of arrows stored on your right. And now that brings me to combat, as with a game like this, it's either going to live or die on whether that aspect of the game works. Undead Citadel's world and combat system both revolve around a real-world physics engine, and that is both the game's best attribute, but also where things start to come apart a bit. First, let's talk about the good. Coming in a variety of configurations and armaments, enemies can be quite lively and unpredictable, flowing into the streets from buildings, above walkways, or perched on ledges, bow in hands. I rarely felt like I was simply being attacked by simply another wave of enemies. Instead, the game attempts to make encounters feel more organic, often letting players stumble into a situation where they might aggro a single character crouched over on the street, and not really knowing whether they had just brought hell down upon themselves in the form of a gang of enemies. These aren't the smartest enemies I've ever fought, but they animate really well and fought dynamically enough that it makes combat feel like a real fight, rather than just swinging at polygons that would flail into a death animation, say like the recently released Everslot. Of course, much of this does have to do with the extra processing power of the PC versus a standalone headset, but the developers have done a nice job here of making combat feel less video gamey. Greatly lending to the dynamics of combat is the different enemies that you'll encounter. You won't find a lot of variety in the types of enemies found here, as they are mostly all ground-based soldiers, but enemies range in their size and attack styles, coming at you in various states of decay and armor, and this can drastically change up how you must deal with them. Whether armed with simply a wood shield or adorned head to toe in heavy armor, enemies' defenses are breakable, and as such, using the right weapon can make all the difference. Need to get to the brain bag of a minion wearing full headgear? Try a spiked mace to expose their head, then bash it to a pulp. Or swing a blade and lop the head straight off. Enemies may not be smart, but learning how to best deal with different variations of them, whether using a melee weapon or my trusty bow, was often quite challenging, and especially when they came at me in numbers. Honestly, combat could have been a bit more gruesome here for my taste, but yes, enemies can be beheaded, crushed, delimbed, and relieved of their lower torso. However, this is where the game's wonky physics start to take away from the fun. Weapons, well, not as weighty as something found in Blade and Sorcery or the Walking Dead games, do indeed have a bit of weight to them, with longer and heavier weapons requiring two hands to use them effectively. Unfortunately, enemies never felt like they themselves had much weight to them, and I found that my attacks would often grab them and fling them around like they were simply stuffed animals. This, when combined with weapons getting stuck inside enemies and some weird animations, and Undead Citadel's combat starts to lose some of its luster. Further to this, enemies never feel like they really have any substance to them. Admittedly, this isn't helped by the fact that I'm getting used to the heavier haptics of the PSVR 2 DualSense controllers, but when carving up or bashing enemies, it just never felt like I was hitting anything with any sense of impact, and enemies seemed to often just carve up with little fanfare or gruesome fun. Another thing that bothered me was how the game handled turning. Yes, it has the option of seated and standing play, and yes, you can choose between smooth and click turning. That's not the issue here. Oddly though, when turning in game using the controller, the game has an odd habit of pushing your arms out, almost like you have rubber arms. It doesn't do this when turning physically though, and once you notice it, you will realize how much it lends to the game's sense of jank during combat, and it's something I'm hoping gets fixed prior to launch. Now don't get me wrong though guys, I actually still had a good time here killing the undead, but I could never quite rid myself of the feeling that this game could have benefited from a bit more time dialing in fighting physics and how the enemies react to being hit. As such, I truly hope that the developers continue to patch the combat here, as games like Blade and Sorcery, Hellsplit Arena, and Swordsmen VR all started out pretty rough in these same regards, and to various degrees of success have greatly improved from their initial launch. Undead Citadel's combat is janky fun, but I think it has the potential to be awesome. Outside of the combat though, Undead Citadel is still a physics-based VR game, and whether players are setting up candles in darkly lit buildings, throwing around pots, or pulling over heavy bookcases, those who like to experiment with VR physics will likely find a lot to love here, as the game is filled with fun things to fool around with. A perfect example of this would be arrows that can be pulled out of dead bodies to be reused, but can only be pulled out fletching first. I love stuff like that. Now, when taken as a whole, Undead Citadel is actually a very simple game. There are no RPG elements or upgrade systems to speak of, and you'll find most of your time fending off similar enemies while searching abandoned buildings to find health, potions, and better weapons. However, I have to admit, I still find Undead Citadel compelling to play through. Yes, the combat is a bit wonky, but it's still fun, and it's helped immensely by the near constant drip of new weapons and areas to explore. Now, when it comes to exploration, the game does lack much in the way of variety and locations, but it is here where I need to talk about the visuals at play here. For when first jumping into the world of Undead Citadel, players will have zero doubt in their mind whether they are playing a standalone or PCVR title. Undead Citadel is straight up a beautiful game. It's not perfect, mind you, and it does suffer from a slight grainy look during the day and off in the distance, as well as some flickering textures and a surprising use of low resolution textures in some places, but as a whole, it is still gorgeous, and much of this is due to the game's chosen washed out color palette and incredible lighting effects. Simply walking around this game in and out of various buildings is honestly almost worth the price of admission alone. With the shadow setting set to ultra, the candlelight effects and darkened streets can at times get to near naturalistic lighting and offer some of the best sense of immersion I've ever had in a VR game. Walking around a house draped in blinding darkness with only a candle in hand to light my way is easily one of my favorite VR moments in quite some time, as I creeped up the stairs to seek out what was upstairs, making those floorboards creak. And it is also here where the game's excellent sound design comes into play, as many a times I walked into a building seeking sustenance to heal from a previous fight, only to hear the grunts, growls, and creaking floorboards of enemies lying in wait. In fact, Undead Citadel is both visually and audio-wise a stunning game, and it certainly shows its long in development time based solely on the quality of its visuals and audio assets. And that brings me to my final thoughts and review score. Undead Citadel is a simple physics-based hack and slasher that has a lot of potential. The inclusion of a full single-player campaign here is a big win for those who love games like Hellsplit Arena, Blade and Sorcery, and Swordsmen VR, but have wanted something more than just arena fights. With a little work, I think its janky combat physics can be ironed out, and if they are, this could actually be a great game to join in the ranks of the games that I just previously mentioned. Beyond that campaign, players are sure to enjoy killing many minions in the game's wave-based arena mode, but just don't expect the depth of options here found in something like, say, Blade and Sorcery. At least not yet, as the developers have talked about adding in new features, including multiplayer. However, as the game currently stands, it's still a bit of fun despite its shortcomings, and I'll admit, does get a pass for me partly due to its visuals and overall immersion. The VR Grid gives Undead Citadel a 7.5 out of 10. If you have an unquenchable bloodlust, you're sure to enjoy this game as is, but for many of you, I would recommend maybe waiting to see if this game gets some updates to its combat first before you decide to jump in. Keep an eye on the channel though, as we are sure to revisit this game when it launches later this year for the PSVR 2. Anyways guys, that's it for me. Hope you enjoyed this video. Leave us a comment below, let us know what you think of the game and whether you're planning on picking it up. I am Chris from the VR Grid, and I will catch you on the next video.
That's right, you stay down.